The United States has issued a new waiver allowing countries to buy sanctioned Russian oil currently at sea for a month. The decision follows pressure from countries facing increased oil prices as a result of the war in Iran. According to Russian officials, the new waiver doubles the amount of Russian oil that can be sold on international markets to around 200 million barrels. U.S. opposition lawmakers have accused the U.S. government of going easy on Moscow as it continues its war on Ukraine. Let's bring in Robin Mills. He's a non-resident fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and he joins us from Dubai. Welcome to DW. Does this U.S. sanctions waiver make Vladimir Putin the biggest beneficiary of the U.S.-Iran war?
Well, absolutely. And Russia and Vladimir Putin have been the biggest beneficiaries of this all the way through because of the distraction of the US and because of the higher oil prices and the easing of sanctions on Russia generally. So absolutely, Russia comes out of this as the big winner, more than obviously any of the countries involved as combatants.
Do we have some concrete figures of just how much Russian oil revenues have risen in recent weeks, and how directly can we link that to what's been happening in the Strait of Hormuz?
Right. So in February, Russia earned just short of $10 billion from exports of crude oil and oil products. I mean, products like diesel and petrol. In March, they earned about 19 billion. So essentially doubling on February. April will be higher still, of course, once we get the full month, depending what happens to oil prices. So yes, a doubling of Russian oil revenues. So obviously oil prices themselves have gone up a lot. Plus the discount for Russian oil has basically disappeared. Before the war, Russia was selling into India at a discount of something like $10 per barrel. Now that discount has disappeared or is perhaps even turned into a premium.
And can we really link this specifically to the situation at the Strait of Hormuz, or are there other key drivers pushing Russian revenues higher right now?
Yeah, there's really three things going on. First is, of course, that just oil prices in general are much higher because of the restriction of the oil going through Hormuz. And, we know oil prices have gone up dramatically since then. Secondly, because of the easing of US sanctions on Russia and just a general feeling that enforcement of those sanctions is laxer, and because India, of course, in particular, needs Russian oil more desperately to replace the oil from the Gulf. Put all those things together, and that means the discount for Russian oil has basically gone away entirely. And then thirdly, Russian oil exports in volume were also up in March. They improved on February. Russian oil exports have been affected by Ukrainian attacks, of course, on the loading terminals. So they're kind of up and down, but overall they were up in March.
So on this U.S. sanctions waiver specifically, as we've mentioned, it only applies to oil that's already at sea. So in practical terms, how large a volume are we really talking about, and is it significant?
So the oil on water from Russia at the moment is about 100 million barrels. So if that sells at about $100 per barrel, that's $10 billion worth of oil that's floating there, that's on its way to customers. So that would be about, let's say, half of Russia's monthly oil revenues. So yes, it's significant for Russia. Is it significant in terms of the global oil market? No, not really. And that most of that oil was going to go to customers anyway. It would have got there sooner or later. But yet, it absolutely makes a big difference to the Russian Treasury. But I think the more significant thing.
Do you go ahead?
The more significant thing here is, I think, what it signals about where the US is going on sanctions. Yes, this waiver is only for a month, but I think we can now expect that the US will keep extending sanctions waivers and that Russian oil from now will sell pretty freely.
I'd like to ask you about the timing of this announcement, because Washington reversed course on this waiver within 48 hours of Treasury Secretary Bessent saying it would not happen. So what does that tell you about U.S. decision-making?
Yeah, well, very confused decision-making, and that's been a feature of this war all the way through. And we knew from the start of this war that it would interrupt and affect U.S. policy on Russia and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and that's absolutely what's happened. Yes, so a lot of mixed messages coming from the US, but the practical effect is, as we've seen all the way through, the US has really taken attention off Russia and is being much softer on Russia now in its campaign against Iran.
Well, Europe has spent years trying to wean itself off Russian energy. Does this waiver effectively undercut that effort? Does Europe have any leverage?
Well, it doesn't help for sure. I mean, look, I think the main effect of the sanctions has been the ban on Russian oil going into Europe, which forces Russia to sell to India and China and other much further destinations. So that costs the Russians. And that policy, I presume, the Europeans will stick with. But certainly it doesn't help this sanctions waiver, which will reduce or eliminate the discount on Russian oil going to these other places. And Europe had also sought to ban people from basically buying Russian crude oil and refining it and shipping the resulting products back to Europe. India was a big part of that. So this doesn't help that policy either.
And if you are advising European governments right now, what's the single most urgent step you believe they should be taking?
Well, I believe they need to keep up the sanctions pressure on Russia, regardless of this measure. Pretty hard to work with the US on this right now, but the EU does have other sanctions levers that it can pull, and I think certainly backing away from those sanctions would send a very bad signal. So even under the stress of the current oil market, I would hope the EU is able to stick with those measures.
That was Robin Mills with the Center on Global Energy Policy. Many thanks indeed for all of your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now let's bring in Benjamin Schmitt. He's an expert on European energy security and previously working as an advisor for the US State Department. He is now with the Kleinman Center for Energy Security at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome to DW News. Benjamin, you've testified before Congress and advised governments on sanctions design. What difference does this waiver make now for the world economy?
Well, I'll tell you what, I've definitely testified before Congress and offered advice to governments, as you said, in the transatlantic community. And this is the sort of measure that I would have always, and of course today, recommend against. This is something that last month when we spoke, it certainly was something that was concerning, but it happened kind of out of nowhere, and it was a month-long waiver. And I said at the time, there's not much that Congress can do to stop this from happening, since it was already a waiver that was out from the Office of Foreign Assets Control at the US Department of the Treasury at the time. But they need to make sure that this is not extended. And frankly, we saw signals in Washington this week that that was not going to happen. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent assured reporters 2 days ago that this would not be extended, that the Russia sanctions waiver would not be extended. And indeed, that is what quietly happened last night on Friday evening, East Coast time here in the United States. And that's a big concern for the sanctions regime against Moscow going forward.
Politics aside, let me ask you again, how much difference does this waiver actually make for the oil-starved world economy?
Look, I mean, obviously, any more barrels that are on the sea right now that can get through to customers, that is going to possibly ease markets to a very small extent. But it's more of a signaling measure, and frankly, again, it's a measure that undermines the consensus in the transatlantic community that has existed for over 4 years now, since 2022, and it took time to build up this sanctions regime. Remember, we didn't start either in the EU or in the US with these large sanctions measures against Russian energy. Indeed, Europe was still importing natural gas from Russia, and it took time to get beyond a price cap from the G7, the EU, and Australia to sanctions, and now this is going in the opposite direction.
How much of a difference makes it for Moscow, though?
Well, this is going to give them another month-long windfall profit. And this is absolutely something that is going to help Russia's ability to wage its war against Ukraine. And for those Republicans on Capitol Hill that long criticized the Biden administration, and rightfully so, for waiving sanctions on Russia's Nord Stream 2 pipeline, this is that in reverse. This is now the Republicans and President Trump waiving sanctions on Russian energy. So I call on Senate Republicans in particular to condemn this move, and we need congressional control to be exerted over these sort of these sort of moves going forward. But indeed, it will give both a political signal to Moscow that it has more life in terms of its invasion of Ukraine, but also more economic lifeline. And that's just something that will undermine transatlantic security, not only Ukraine, but the entire transatlantic community from top to bottom.
Does this, in a way, torpedo the whole sanctions framework, blunting the weapon, if you will?
Well, it certainly blunts the weapon. I don't know that it torpedoes the entire sanctions framework because, again, now we're only looking at a 1-month extension. It absolutely cannot be extended again. And frankly, it should be revoked as quickly as possible. That would do a lot of good to basically put the the genie back in the bottle in terms of waivers and basically reinforce this sanctions regime. But we need to be vigilant on all fronts. And in the European Union and NATO countries in Europe absolutely have done an increasingly tight job in terms of sanctions enforcement. We've seen a lot of Russian shadow fleet vessels be detained, seized, and otherwise impeded from getting through the Western sanctions. But there's hundreds and hundreds of these vessels. We're talking about maybe a half dozen to a dozen that have actually been detained at this point. So there's a lot of work that has to be done on the technical side to make sure that enforcement happens. But again, these sort of measures where the U.S. is saying that Russian Urals crude grade oil that is on the high seas already is able to go through without sanctions concerns. That is an absolute national security disaster once again from President Trump when it comes to his policy towards Ukraine.
The energy policy expert Benjamin Schmitt there. Thank you very much, Benjamin.
Thank you. Great to be on DW.